A man cut a wild bear free from a tangle of barbed wire, unsure of what would happen next. Her reaction was absolutely jaw-dropping. What happens next will leave you speechless. Deep in the wilderness of Pine Ridge Forest, Marcus Thornfield worked as a wildlife conservation officer for the fictional Greenwood Wildlife Protection Agency. At 32 years old, Marcus had dedicated his life to protecting the animals that called this vast woodland home, following in the footsteps of his late father who had been a ranger before him. Every morning, Marcus would patrol the forest trails on foot, checking for illegal traps, monitoring wildlife populations, and ensuring that the delicate ecosystem remained undisturbed. His colleagues at the agency, including his supervisor Daniel Crawford and fellow officer James Mitchell, often praised Marcus for his unwavering commitment and his almost supernatural ability to connect with wild animals. Marcus carried with him a worn leather journal where he documented every significant wildlife encounter, a habit that had helped him track animal behavior patterns and identify potential threats to their safety. The forest had been experiencing an unusual surge in illegal hunting activities, with poachers setting up dangerous wire traps and snares throughout the remote areas. These crude devices not only threatened the wildlife, but also posed serious risks to hikers and campers who frequented the popular nature trails during the summer months. On a particularly crisp autumn morning, Marcus set out earlier than usual, driven by reports from local hikers about strange sounds coming from the deeper sections of the forest near Willowbrook Creek. The area was known for its dense undergrowth and rocky terrain, making it a perfect hiding spot for illegal trapping operations. As Marcus made his way through the familiar paths, he noticed disturbed vegetation and broken branches that suggested recent human activity in areas where visitors rarely ventured. His trained eye picked up on subtle signs that others might miss: bent twigs pointing in unnatural directions, fresh boot prints in the soft earth, and the faint metallic glint of wire partially hidden beneath fallen leaves. The morning mist clung to the forest floor, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that would have been peaceful under different circumstances. Marcus had encountered poachers before, but something about this particular situation felt different, more urgent somehow. His instincts, honed by years of experience in the wilderness, told him that he was about to stumble upon something significant. The distant sound of rushing water from the creek masked other forest sounds, making it difficult to detect the presence of trapped animals or hidden dangers. Unknown to Marcus, a local crime syndicate led by the ruthless Vincent Blackwood had been using the remote sections of Pine Ridge Forest as a base for their illegal wildlife trafficking operation. Blackwood, a former military contractor turned criminal mastermind, had assembled a team of experienced poachers including his Lieutenant Samuel Ridge and demolitions expert Tony Garrett. Their operation extended far beyond simple hunting, involving the capture and sale of rare animals to private collectors and underground fighting rings in distant cities. The syndicate had been carefully mapping the forest for months, identifying the movement patterns of valuable wildlife and establishing strategic locations for their sophisticated trapping systems. They used military-grade equipment and tactics, making their operation far more dangerous and effective than typical poaching activities. Blackwood had specifically chosen Pine Ridge Forest because of its remote location and the limited patrol coverage by conservation officers, believing that the vast wilderness would provide perfect cover for their criminal enterprise. The recent increase in trapping activity that Marcus had observed was actually the beginning phase of a major operation that Blackwood planned to execute over the coming weeks. The syndicate had already captured several rare birds and smaller mammals, storing them in a hidden facility deeper in the forest while they prepared for their biggest prize, a family of black bears that had been spotted in the Willowbrook Creek area. As Marcus continued his patrol, following the creek bed toward the source of the reported disturbances, he began to notice more obvious signs of organized criminal activity. Fresh tire tracks in the mud suggested that heavy vehicles had been accessing the area through an old logging road that was supposed to be permanently closed to motor traffic. Scattered pieces of professional-grade camping equipment, including camouflaged tarps and high-tech communication devices, indicated that whoever was operating in the forest had significant resources and experience. Marcus realized that he was dealing with something far more serious than casual poaching, and he began to question whether he should call for backup before proceeding further into the remote area. However, his concern for potentially trapped animals overrode his caution, and he decided to continue the patrol while maintaining radio contact with his headquarters. The forest seemed unusually quiet, with even the typical bird songs noticeably absent from the areas where he detected human activity. Marcus checked his equipment, ensuring that his radio, first aid kit, and emergency flares were easily accessible, though he hoped that his morning patrol would conclude without incident. Little did he know that his decision to continue alone would soon lead him into a life-changing encounter that would test not only his skills as a conservation officer, but also his courage and compassion in ways he had never imagined. The sound that stopped Marcus in his tracks was unlike anything he had encountered in his years of forest patrol. A deep, guttural combination of pain, frustration, and exhaustion that seemed to echo through the trees near Willowbrook Creek. Following the desperate sounds, Marcus carefully made his way through a thicket of thorny bushes and emerged into a small clearing where he witnessed a sight that made his heart sink with both sympathy and anger. A massive female black bear, easily weighing over 300 pounds, was entangled in a complex web of barbed wire that had been deliberately constructed around the base of several large oak trees. The cruel trap was designed not just to capture, but to cause maximum suffering, with multiple layers of razor-sharp wire that tightened around the bear's body with every movement she made in her attempts to escape. Marcus could see that the magnificent animal had been struggling for what appeared to be hours, possibly even days, as evidenced by the worn patches of earth around the trap and the exhaustion visible in her movements. Blood stained her thick black fur where the barbed wire had cut into her flesh, and her breathing was labored from the prolonged ordeal. Despite her obvious pain and fear, there was still a fierce intelligence in her dark eyes that seemed to assess Marcus as he approached, calculating whether this new human presence represented another threat or a potential source of help. Marcus immediately understood that he was facing a life-or-death situation that required immediate action, but he also recognized the extreme danger involved in attempting to free such a large and frightened wild animal. His training had covered basic animal rescue techniques, but nothing had prepared him for the complexity of this particular trap or the size and power of the creature that needed his help. The bear's position made it impossible for her to lie down or find a comfortable resting position, forcing her to remain standing in an unnatural pose that put additional stress on her already compromised physical condition. Marcus could see that several of the wire loops had cut deeply into her flesh, creating wounds that would require immediate medical attention if the animal was going to survive this ordeal. The trap had been constructed with a level of cruelty that went beyond mere capture, suggesting that whoever had built it took pleasure in causing suffering to these innocent creatures. As Marcus circled the trap at a safe distance, he noticed other signs of the poacher's presence, including empty food containers, cigarette butts, and boot prints that indicated multiple people had been involved in setting up this elaborate torture device. The realization that humans could be capable of such deliberate cruelty toward a helpless animal filled Marcus with a righteous anger that strengthened his resolve to help, despite the obvious risks to his own safety. The bear's reaction to Marcus's presence was initially one of wariness and defensive posturing, but as the experienced conservation officer began speaking to her in calm, soothing tones, something remarkable began to happen. Years of working with wild animals had taught Marcus that most creatures, even predators, could sense genuine intentions and respond accordingly to human behavior and vocal patterns. He positioned himself where the bear could see him clearly, while maintaining a respectful distance that wouldn't trigger her fight-or-flight instincts in her already compromised state. Marcus began a slow, methodical assessment of the trap's construction, looking for the safest and most effective way to begin the freeing process without causing additional injury to the bear or putting himself in unnecessary danger. The barbed wire had been arranged in overlapping layers, with some sections designed to tighten when pressure was applied, creating a diabolical puzzle that would require careful planning and precise execution to solve. Marcus realized that he would need to work systematically, starting with the outer layers of wire and gradually working inward toward the sections that were most tightly embedded in the bear's flesh. The process would be time-consuming and would require the bear's cooperation, something that seemed unlikely given her current state of stress and pain. However, Marcus had witnessed enough remarkable moments in his career to believe that wild animals possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand when humans were genuinely trying to help them. As Marcus began to formulate his rescue plan, he became aware of voices and footsteps approaching through the forest from the direction of the old logging road. The poachers were returning, probably to check on their trapped prize and possibly to transport the bear to whatever fate they had planned for her. Marcus quickly assessed his options and realized that he had perhaps 10 minutes before the criminals would discover his presence and potentially put both him and the bear in even greater danger. His radio crackled with static, but the remote location and dense tree coverage made communication with headquarters spotty at best, meaning that backup was not an immediate option. The approaching voices carried a casual, almost jovial tone that suggested the poachers had no idea that their trap had been discovered by a conservation officer, giving Marcus a temporary advantage that he knew he had to use wisely. He could attempt to hide and wait for them to leave, but the bear's obvious distress and deteriorating condition made it clear that time was running out for her survival. Alternatively, he could try to confront the poachers directly, but he was outnumbered and outgunned, with no way of knowing how many criminals were involved or what kind of weapons they might be carrying. The most dangerous but potentially most effective option was to attempt a rapid rescue of the bear, hoping that he could free her quickly enough to give them both a chance to escape before the poachers realized what was happening. Marcus made his decision with the kind of split-second judgment that had served him well throughout his career, choosing to trust in his skills, his experience, and perhaps most importantly, in the remarkable intelligence and survival instincts of the magnificent creature that desperately needed his help. Without hesitation, Marcus pulled out his multi-tool and began working on the outermost layer of barbed wire, speaking continuously to the bear in low, reassuring tones while his hands moved with practiced efficiency. The first few cuts were relatively easy, as these wires carried less tension and weren't deeply embedded in the bear's flesh, but Marcus knew that the real challenge lay ahead with the inner loops that had cut into her body. Remarkably, the bear seemed to understand that Marcus was trying to help her, and she remained surprisingly still despite her obvious pain and the natural instinct to flee from human contact. As each wire was cut and carefully pulled away, Marcus could see the relief in the bear's posture, though he also noticed that some of the wounds were bleeding more freely now that the pressure from the wires had been released. The voices of the approaching poachers grew louder, and Marcus could make out at least 3 distinct male voices discussing their plans for transporting their merchandise to a buyer in the city. Time was running out, but Marcus forced himself to work methodically rather than rushing, knowing that a single mistake could result in serious injury to either himself or the bear. The animal's eyes never left Marcus as he worked, and he found himself marveling at the trust she was displaying toward a member of the same species that had caused her current predicament. The most challenging part of the rescue came when Marcus reached the wires that had cut deepest into the bear's flesh, particularly around her shoulders and hindquarters, where the trap's designers had concentrated the most vicious elements of their creation. These wires had to be cut with extreme precision to avoid causing additional injury, and Marcus found himself working inches away from powerful claws and teeth that could easily end his life if the bear decided he represented a threat. Instead, something extraordinary happened that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. The bear actually leaned into his work, adjusting her position to give him better access to the most difficult sections of wire, almost as if she understood the complexity of what he was trying to accomplish. Blood from her wounds stained Marcus's hands and clothing, but he continued working with steady determination, cutting through wire after wire while keeping one ear tuned to the approaching voices that seemed to be getting closer with each passing minute. The bear's breathing became more regular as the pressure from the trap was gradually released, and Marcus could see that despite her injuries, she was a magnificent and powerful animal who would have an excellent chance of survival once she was free from this human-made nightmare. The trust that was developing between them transcended the normal boundaries between human and wild animal, creating a connection that Marcus had experienced only a few times in his career as a conservation officer. Just as Marcus cut through the final section of wire that had been holding the bear captive, the voices of the poachers suddenly became much clearer, indicating that they had reached the edge of the clearing and would discover the rescue operation within seconds. The bear, now free but still bleeding from multiple wounds, looked directly at Marcus with what he could only describe as an expression of gratitude and understanding that defied everything he thought he knew about wild animal behavior. Instead of immediately fleeing into the forest as Marcus had expected, the bear remained close to him, almost as if she sensed that they were both still in danger from the approaching criminals. Marcus quickly gathered up the cut sections of barbed wire, hoping to eliminate evidence of the rescue and possibly delay the poacher's understanding of what had happened, though he knew it was probably a futile gesture given the obvious signs of disturbance around the trap site. The first poacher, a tall man with a scraggly beard wearing military-style camouflage, emerged from the tree line and immediately spotted Marcus and the freed bear, his expression changing from casual confidence to shocked surprise and then to dangerous anger. Marcus recognized him as Samuel Ridge from wanted posters that had been circulated among conservation officers, and he knew that Ridge had a reputation for violence and had previously been arrested for assaulting park rangers in other states. The moment of mutual recognition between Marcus and Ridge seemed to last forever, with both men understanding that this encounter would not end peacefully and that the next few minutes would determine whether Marcus would survive to tell the story of his remarkable rescue operation. The bear's reaction to the appearance of the poachers was immediate and dramatic, transforming her from a grateful rescued animal into a protective force of nature that positioned herself between Marcus and the approaching criminals. Ridge shouted warnings to his companions, who emerged from the forest carrying rifles and other equipment that made it clear they had been prepared for a major wildlife capture operation. Marcus realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented, a wild bear actively choosing to protect a human who had helped her, rather than simply fleeing to safety as any normal animal would do. The other poachers, including a heavyset man with distinctive tattoos covering his arms, and a younger man carrying what appeared to be professional photography equipment, spread out in an attempt to surround both Marcus and the bear, clearly intending to recapture the animal and eliminate the witness to their illegal operation. However, they had seriously underestimated both the intelligence of the bear and the protective instincts that Marcus's act of kindness had awakened in her. What followed was a confrontation that defied all conventional wisdom about human-wildlife interactions, as the bear and the conservation officer found themselves working together against a common enemy in a way that neither of them could have anticipated when this extraordinary morning began. The forest clearing, which had been the site of deliberate cruelty just minutes before, was about to become the stage for a demonstration of the powerful bond that can develop between humans and animals when mutual respect and compassion replace fear and exploitation. The confrontation that erupted in the forest clearing was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his years as a conservation officer, as the freed bear demonstrated an almost supernatural understanding of the dangerous situation and an apparent determination to protect the human who had saved her life. Ridge and his two companions, Vincent Russo and Jake Matthews, had clearly expected to find their trapped prize waiting helplessly for transport, not a freed animal standing alongside a conservation officer who had obviously discovered their illegal operation. The bear, despite her injuries and exhaustion, positioned herself in a defensive stance that made it clear she considered Marcus to be under her protection, her massive frame creating a living barrier between the conservation officer and the armed poachers. Ridge raised his rifle, but hesitated when he realized that any shot at Marcus would have to go through or around the bear, who was watching his every movement with intelligent eyes that seemed to calculate his intentions before he even acted on them. Marcus used this moment of confusion to activate his emergency beacon, hoping that the signal would reach headquarters despite the remote location and that backup would arrive before the situation escalated further. The other two poachers attempted to flank the unusual pair, but the bear's keen senses allowed her to track their movements even while keeping her primary attention focused on Ridge, who was clearly the leader of the group and posed the most immediate threat. What happened next challenged everything that wildlife experts thought they knew about black bear behavior and intelligence, as the rescued animal began to actively coordinate her defensive actions with Marcus's movements in a way that suggested genuine tactical cooperation. When Russo tried to circle around to Marcus's left, the bear moved to block his path while making warning sounds that indicated she was prepared to attack if he came any closer. Matthews, apparently the least experienced member of the poaching group, made the mistake of assuming that an injured bear would be easy to intimidate, and he approached with his camera equipment raised as if he intended to document their recapture of the animal. The bear's response was swift and decisive. She charged toward Matthews with a speed that seemed impossible given her recent ordeal, stopping just short of actual contact, but making it absolutely clear that any further advance would result in serious consequences. The young poacher stumbled backward, dropping his expensive equipment and nearly falling over a fallen log in his haste to retreat to what he hoped was a safe distance. Ridge shouted orders to his companions, but it was becoming increasingly obvious that their simple plan to collect their trapped prize had been transformed into a complex and dangerous confrontation with both an armed conservation officer and a highly intelligent animal who had apparently decided to fight alongside the human who had freed her from their cruel trap. Marcus found himself in the surreal position of coordinating his defensive movements with those of a wild bear, using hand signals and body language that the animal seemed to understand and respond to with remarkable accuracy. When Ridge attempted to get a clear shot at Marcus, the bear moved to obstruct his line of fire, and when Russo tried to use his position to threaten the bear, Marcus stepped forward to draw the poacher's attention back to himself. This unprecedented cooperation between human and animal created a defensive strategy that the poachers had no training or experience to counter, as their standard tactics for dealing with wildlife or conservation officers were useless against such an unusual partnership. The bear's injuries, while painful and bleeding, did not seem to significantly hamper her ability to move quickly and decisively when the situation required it, suggesting that her determination to protect Marcus was providing her with reserves of strength and endurance that she might not otherwise have possessed. Marcus could see that the poachers were becoming increasingly frustrated and desperate, which made them more dangerous, but also more likely to make mistakes that could be exploited if the right opportunity presented itself. The forest around them seemed to have gone completely silent, as if all the other wildlife in the area sensed the tension and danger of the confrontation taking place in the small clearing beside Willowbrook Creek. The turning point in the confrontation came when Ridge, apparently deciding that the situation had become too complicated and risky to salvage, made the decision to eliminate both Marcus and the bear rather than attempt to continue their original capture plan. As he raised his rifle for what was clearly intended to be a lethal shot, the bear's protective instincts triggered a response that demonstrated the full power and intelligence that had made her such a prized target for the illegal wildlife trade. She launched herself toward Ridge with a combination of speed, power, and tactical awareness that caught the experienced poacher completely off guard. knocking the rifle from his hands and sending him sprawling into the underbrush before he could fire a single shot. Marcus seized the opportunity to radio for immediate emergency assistance, finally managing to establish clear communication with headquarters and request backup along with medical support for both human and animal casualties. Russo and Matthews, seeing their leader overcome by the very animal they had intended to capture, made the rapid decision that discretion was the better part of valor and began retreating toward their vehicle, abandoning Ridge to whatever fate awaited him in the forest clearing. The bear, having neutralized the immediate threat, returned to Marcus's side and resumed her protective stance, though her breathing was becoming more labored as the adrenaline of the confrontation began to wear off and the pain from her injuries reasserted itself. Marcus realized that while they had successfully defended themselves against the poachers, the bear's condition was becoming critical, and she would need immediate veterinary attention if she was going to survive the trauma of both her initial capture and the subsequent rescue and confrontation. The aftermath of the extraordinary confrontation brought rapid changes to Pine Ridge Forest as emergency responders, wildlife veterinarians, and law enforcement officers converged on the remote clearing beside Willowbrook Creek. Dr. Michael Harrison, the region's leading wildlife veterinarian, arrived by helicopter along with a specialized animal rescue team, and his first priority was treating the bear's injuries from the barbed wire trap while she remained surprisingly calm in Marcus's presence, as if she understood that these new humans were there to help rather than harm her. The veterinary team worked with remarkable efficiency, administering pain medication and antibiotics while cleaning and suturing the deepest wounds, all while Marcus stayed close enough that the bear could see him and remained reassured by his familiar presence throughout the medical procedures. Samuel Ridge was taken into custody by Sheriff Tom Bradley and his deputies, though the poacher's injuries from his encounter with the protective bear required him to be transported to the regional medical center under armed guard before he could be formally processed and charged with his crimes. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Vincent Blackwood's wildlife trafficking operation, leading to arrests across 3 states and the rescue of dozens of animals that had been destined for illegal private collections and underground fighting rings in major cities. Dr. Harrison's examination revealed that despite the severity of her wounds, the bear's injuries were primarily superficial and would heal completely with proper care and time, though he recommended that she be monitored at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center for several weeks to ensure that no infections developed and that she regained her full strength before being released back into her natural habitat. Marcus visited the rehabilitation center daily during the bear's recovery period, and the staff was amazed by the continued bond between the conservation officer and the animal he had saved, noting that her healing process seemed to accelerate whenever Marcus was present and that she showed signs of distress when he was away for extended periods. The remarkable story of the rescue and the subsequent protective behavior displayed by the bear attracted national attention from wildlife organizations, conservation groups, and animal behavior researchers who were fascinated by the level of apparent gratitude and loyalty demonstrated by a wild animal toward a human benefactor. Dr. Patricia Wells, a renowned animal behaviorist from the University of Greenfield, conducted extensive interviews with Marcus and reviewed video footage of the incident captured by security cameras that had been hidden in the forest by the poaching operation, concluding that the bear's behavior represented a previously undocumented level of cognitive and emotional sophistication in black bear interactions with humans. The legal proceedings against the poaching syndicate resulted in significant prison sentences for all involved parties, with Ridge receiving the longest term due to his leadership role and previous criminal record, while Russo and Matthews received shorter sentences in exchange for their testimony against Vincent Blackwood, who was ultimately sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for his role in organizing the multi-state wildlife trafficking operation. Marcus received commendations from both the Greenwood Wildlife Protection Agency and the National Conservation Officers Association for his courage and quick thinking during the rescue operation, though he insisted that the real hero of the story was the bear herself, whose intelligence and protective instincts had saved both of their lives during the confrontation with the armed poachers. The publicity surrounding the incident led to increased funding for wildlife protection programs and stronger legislation against illegal animal trafficking, with Marcus testifying before state legislative committees about the sophisticated methods being used by modern poaching operations and the need for better equipment and training for conservation officers. The bond between Marcus and the bear, whom the rehabilitation staff had nicknamed Liberty in honor of her liberation from the cruel trap, continued to fascinate researchers and wildlife enthusiasts, with several documentary film crews requesting permission to record their interactions during her recovery period. When the day finally came for Liberty's release back into Pine Ridge Forest, Marcus was given the honor of opening the transport crate that would allow her to return to her natural habitat, fully healed and apparently no worse for her traumatic experience with human cruelty and human kindness. The release took place in a remote section of the forest far from any roads or hiking trails, ensuring that Liberty would have the peace and solitude she needed to readjust to life in the wild without human interference. As the crate door opened, Liberty emerged slowly and looked directly at Marcus for what both of them seemed to understand would be their final meeting, and witnesses reported that the expression of mutual respect and affection between the conservation officer and the bear was one of the most moving sights they had ever witnessed. Liberty touched Marcus's outstretched hand gently with her nose before turning and walking calmly into the forest, disappearing among the trees with the quiet dignity that had characterized her behavior throughout the entire ordeal. Marcus continued his patrols of Pine Ridge Forest with renewed dedication and purpose, often passing through the area where he had first encountered Liberty in the barbed wire trap, and while he never saw her again, he occasionally found evidence of her presence in the form of tracks, scratched trees, and other signs that indicated she was thriving in her forest home. The story of Marcus and Liberty became a legend among conservation officers and wildlife enthusiasts across the region, inspiring a new generation of young people to pursue careers in wildlife protection and conservation. Marcus established the Liberty Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating illegal wildlife trafficking and providing advanced training for conservation officers dealing with sophisticated poaching operations, funded in part by donations from people who had been moved by the story of the remarkable bond between a conservation officer and the bear whose life he had saved. The Foundation's work led to the development of new technologies for detecting and dismantling illegal trapping operations, as well as improved protocols for rescue operations involving large and potentially dangerous wild animals. Years later, Marcus would often reflect on that extraordinary morning beside Willowbrook Creek, remembering not just the danger and excitement of the confrontation with the poachers, but the profound moment of connection he had experienced with another living being who had demonstrated that trust, gratitude, and protective loyalty were not exclusively human emotions. The lesson he learned from Liberty, that compassion and courage could bridge even the greatest differences between species, became the guiding principle of his continued work in wildlife conservation and the foundation of his belief that humans had a responsibility to protect and preserve the magnificent creatures who shared their world. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of compassion, unexpected animal behavior, and the profound bonds that can form between humans and nature. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of empathy, inspire a deeper respect for wildlife, and remind us that a single act of kindness can have a life-altering impact.